What is going on, guys? I am Paul Ryan, your host of the Not ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is the best co-host in the world, sad Dolphins fan and creator of the Pigskin Papers website, Dave Pigskin Papers Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. I probably watched a little too much football this past weekend with 6 games, only one of which was a good game, but that didn't stop me from watching most of the action. But I've recovered from that, and I'm looking forward to another jam-packed weekend of NFL football. It's also, and we'll get into this, just been kind of a crazy week with all the big coaching news too. So it's been a lot to digest for football fans. And has kept my mind very busy thinking about the NFL. How about you? How are you doing after the Cowboys loss? And what's going on?
Not much is going on. I'm doing about as good as you can be after an embarrassing loss like that, Dave.
I hear you.
Well, Dave, where can we find you on X, sir?
Yes, I am at Pigskin Papers. Both of those P's are capitalized, and my website is thepigskинpapers.com. I haven't written anything since the end of the regular season. I'll probably write some stuff after the divisional round and then leading up to the Super Bowl. How about for you, Paul? Where can people find you on X, and how can they get out your content?
Yes, I am Paul Ryan. You can find me on X at Paul_Ryan15. You can find all my content these days either on YouTube or or streaming on Twitter across the Cowboys. We're going to be after the playoffs transitioning into our off-season content where that's more guest focused, where we bring on fans to do mock drafts and to talk about the relationship with the Cowboys and all sorts of fun things. So I'm excited for that.
Excellent.
All right, Dave. Well, here we are after what turned out to be an unpredictable and wild card weekend. Tonight, Dave and I will be recapping the games from this past weekend and previewing the divisional round. Dave, this weekend was bittersweet for both of us as both their teams were eliminated in the first round. We'll start off with your Miami Dolphins. Dave, when you look at the Dolphins and after all the mounting injuries during the season, a collapse was bound to happen in Miami. Do you hold their playoff performance against the players and coaching staff?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, I don't think it was bittersweet. I think it was just bitter for both of us, with both of our teams losing convincingly. And, it was kind of, we were talking about this a little bit before we came on the air. It was kind of, in a lot of ways, the Cowboys and Dolphins had similar seasons. They were both kind of early season juggernauts and, scoring a ton of points. But they both kind of had that reputation of you can beat the bad teams. Can you beat, the playoff teams, the good teams? They played each other, which was actually Miami's only win over a team with a winning record. The Cowboys had that big win over the Eagles, but that doesn't look so good now, given how Philly fell apart and, finished their season. And then both teams flame out in the first round. And have questions about their coach, their quarterback, and everything else. And we'll get into all that. I mean, I think, it was a disappointing finish for the Dolphins, not just losing that playoff game at Kansas City, but the fact that they, had a 3-game lead in their division, which they blew, which caused them to be playing, in 10 below temperatures instead of a home game in 70-degree weather, which they're more, I think, built for. In Miami. I think it was a whole team kind of, I won't say collapse, but, they had a million injuries on their defense, and actually their defense played okay on Saturday. But I think, I would, if I'm going to point fingers, I think the whole team kind of owns it. I don't think they came in with a very good game plan against the Chiefs, or maybe it was just, there was no way they were winning that game on the road in those weather conditions. Tua's now 0-5 in NFL games and college games, I think, combined where the game time temperature was below 45 degrees. But they lost a lot of key players on both sides of the ball down the stretch. But their last 4 games, after they beat the Cowboys, or their last 3 games, they played, probably the three best teams in the AFC, in the Ravens, the Bills, and the Chiefs, and they couldn't beat any of them. And even worse than that, I don't think they scored a point in the second half in any of those three games. They might have kicked a field goal against the Ravens. I can't remember. And that's just bad. Like they had this juggernaut offense all year. And yeah, they were without Waddle and Mostert for two of those games, but they really couldn't get it done. And, we'll get into this a little later, but, I think they have a real question about what to do with Tua, who has his option year next year. Led the NFL in passing yards, but as a Dolphin fan, I felt good about him at times this year, but he really didn't come through in any big spot other than week one, where he rallied them against what turned out to be a pretty bad Chargers defense. So, they had a better season than last season, but the same result, losing in round one. And I would just put it on really the team and the staff for not just the losing the Chiefs game, but kind of why they were even playing on the road when it looked like they had a stranglehold on their division a month ago. So we could talk now for a minute about your team. And about an hour before we came on the air, news broke that Mike McCarthy will be back next year. And, I think Jerry Jones and the Cowboys organization took a lot of heat for how long they stuck with Jason Garrett before they hired Mike McCarthy. I think his tenure was close to like 9 or 10 seasons. He was there for a really long time with them never getting to a conference championship. So how do you feel, Paul, about McCarthy getting another year? Did you think, given the collapse on Sunday, that this should have been his last game as Cowboys coach?
I don't know how much of the collapse I put on McCarthy. Of course, you put some of it on McCarthy. A lot of it was, for me personally, you put it on Dan Quinn and the defense, and some on Dak, and some, of course, on McCarthy, like I said. But after it happened, I was texting with my co-host. Shout out to CD Piglet. Shout out to Brendan Smith. You can find them on X there. That, maybe, what if we just run it back one more year with McCarthy and Dak, and maybe even Dan Quinn. Of course, probably Dan Quinn's not going to come back, and I'm fine with that. But even just running it back one more year with McCarthy and Dak, and kind of prove it seasons, because Dak's owed a lot of money, and you mentioned Tua not really showing up in big moments. There's been some big moments for Dak to show up, and he hasn't. And there's been some big moments where he has shown up. So I'm okay with it. I kind of want to know what's going to happen with Dak. Of course, I'd like to keep Dak, but at the same time, I don't hate the idea of a prove it year for him. And I hope he proves everybody wrong, but I don't hate the idea of making them both prove it this year.
Yeah, McCarthy has won 12 games, and gotten to the playoffs in 3 straight seasons. It's just the flameouts in the playoffs that have been, I would say, frustrating for Cowboys fans. And there's such a microscope on the Cowboys, like more than any team. They're kind of like the Yankees of the NFL, in that they have the largest national following. They get a ton of primetime games. Their owner is probably the most easily identified owner in the NFL, probably gets shown in his luxury box more than any other owner when they're on TV. They have that old moniker, America's team. It just seems like they're in a fishbowl, and, more than any other NFL team. And I'm sure that a lot of people were watching that game on Sunday and just celebrating Dallas falling on its face like that, because when you are that team, even though they haven't won a Super Bowl in a long time, when you are that team that's kind of front and center, and, certainly the most valuable franchise, not only in the NFL, but probably in at least the 4 major sports. There might be some European soccer teams that are worth more money if they were put on the market. But, you're in that fishbowl, and that's tough. And I think a lot of people will second guess the decision to keep McCarthy, but more than any other team, like, people are going to comment on what's going on with the Cowboys, because they're just like I said, they're just in that fishbowl.
Yeah, and this Cowboys talk is going to really dominate a lot of the playoffs, at least this divisional round too. You know that.
Yeah.
All right, so Dave, people on Twitter, aka X, think it's time to part ways with both Mike McDaniel and Tua. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I haven't seen that much on McDaniel. He's been there 2 years, and they've made the playoffs both years with an improvement from 9 wins to 11 wins, and they hadn't made the playoffs in a bunch of years before that. Although, interestingly, I think they are now, with Detroit winning, they now have the longest drought of any NFL team since their last playoff win, because they've lost their last bunch of play. I forget what year it was. It might be like 2008 that they last won a playoff game. But I think, look, McDaniel, again, it was a rough finish this year, but I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he certainly gets one more year at least, because the team has made the playoffs with him, and they have turned around what had been a pretty bad franchise for a bunch of years. As for Tua, the Tua hate has been there since, he was the sort of presumptive number 1 overall pick. Then Joe Burrow had that crazy year and Tua had that bad injury. And, Burrow was clearly the number 1 pick, but Miami took Tua over Herbert immediately, and then over Jordan Love and Jalen Hurts, who went later, much later in that draft. And this was sort of, for the first half of the season, it looked like Tua had kind of finally maybe put it all together, with the team leading the NFL in scoring. And for much of the season, he led the NFL in both yards and touchdown passes and yards per attempt. He did end up leading the league in yards and yards per attempt. And, when everything is working right and they've surrounded him with a lot of talent, and before they had all those offensive line injuries, and before Tyreek got hurt and Waddle got hurt, it was humming, and it was against a lot of bad defenses. But, he's shown enough that there's something there. But like I said when you asked me the first question, he has not come up big, at least this season, especially in big games. And, Miami's in an interesting place with him because they exercised his option. So this is his 5th season coming up, but he's under contract for this season because they exercised the option. Their GM, Greer, came out yesterday and said, we're committed to Tua long term, but I'm not sure that they're going to sign him to an extension this off season. They might, kind of give him one more year to prove it. And it'd be kind of like Lamar Jackson, he's playing on the option year without an extension. Now, that was because they wanted to sign Lamar, and Lamar didn't want to sign for what they were offering him. And it took till after that year. They could not extend Tua this offseason, let him play on the option. And if he has a great year, or at least a good enough year, then try to sign him to an extension. And if that doesn't work, they can always use the franchise tag for 2 seasons, up to 2 seasons. But you also don't want to burn the bridge. And you have to look at what's the other option. Like, this team is kind of built to win now. Tyreek's going to be 30. They have a bunch of other veterans on both sides of the ball, like Jalen Ramsey and Teron Armstead, if he comes back, and Connor Williams, assuming he comes back from his injury, and other players. So, like, what's the alternative? It's not like they have another quarterback. They don't have a good draft position, so they're not going to get one who can start right away. They maybe get one that can compete with Tua. There's free agents like Kirk Cousins out there, but I think it makes sense for them to give him another year, and then, just sort of play it out for a year and see if he improves and can win more big games and play better in big spots, and especially on the road. So that's my answer with regards to Tua. I would love to see him be the long-term answer for them. But after 4 years, he has not climbed into the upper echelon of quarterbacks. He's kind of in that second group, with Dak and some other quarterbacks. And unfortunately not, hasn't climbed into that top group.
Yeah.
We'll talk about your quarterback now because I just mentioned him. He's kind of in that same tier. He's just older, and he wasn't a first round draft pick, so he was. Dallas got lucky hitting it as big as they did with. He was a fourth rounder, Dak.
Yes, sir. Fourth round.
So that's they did really well there. He's coming off the best season of his career, but he kind of failed when it mattered most, and his pick six probably ended any hope that Dallas had of making that a game. He has a cap hit of $59 million this year. So how much longer, and you kind of alluded to this when you spoke before, but how much longer should Dallas commit to him and ride with him as their franchise QB, do you think?
I don't know. It's, like I was saying earlier, that with McCarthy coming back, I mean, do you just, if it fails again, if there's another first round playoff exit, or if there's, if they make it to the NFC Championship game and they lose, I think you run it back, and I think that would be enough to say, okay, Dak is taking yet another step after having an MVP season. And a game that, you look at that Green Bay game, it almost feels like fluky. Like, I think if those teams were to play 10 more times, I think Green Bay maybe wins one, maybe two. But I just, man, if you bring back McCarthy, I think having Dak on a prove-it one-year deal, I'm okay with that. But realistically, I'd like to see Dak finish his career as a Cowboy, and I'd be happy to ride with him for 5 years or so, 5 more years.
I hear you. Yeah, I mean, that game was, when you're playing against the youngest team in the NFL that sort of has nothing to lose and is playing really loose, and there was a lot of pressure on the Cowboys. You could sort of see it early. Dak was sailing some throws, and the fact that Green Bay took the opening kickoff and just went down the field was obviously a bad omen for what was going to happen in that game. And they ran right at them, and that's, I think, something Dallas needs. And I know they had some injuries at linebacker, but they're a small defense. They're kind of a small speed defense, and when they get behind in games and teams, can kind of game script run at them. Dallas had a lot of blowouts this year, so they had a lot of games where, they were up early, especially at home, big, and teams had to throw, and Parsons and Lawrence and, the pass rushers could just pin their ears back and go after the quarterback, and the safeties and corners could just, sit in zone and intercept passes or break up passes. But when they fell behind in games, and you saw it in the Buffalo game and you saw it in this game, and their defense is on its heels, and it's a small defense, they kind of got pushed around pretty bad, I thought, by Aaron Jones in that running game. But anyway, like you said, I mean, anything can happen in one playoff game, and we'll get into that when we preview the coming round. So let's shift now to recapping some of the other games from this weekend. And it wasn't all bad news in the state of Texas, because while Dallas was giving up 48 points across the state, I guess it was the day before. I'm losing track of which game was on which day. Yeah, it was the day before. The Texans and CJ Stroud went up against one of the best defenses in the NFL and, put 45 on them. I know they had 2 pick sixes, so there wasn't quite 45 on offense, but, Baltimore and San Francisco, clearly the 2 best teams in the NFL, or one would think so. But, do the Texans belong where they are right now? Like, are they right at the top of that next group of teams with the way they've been playing down the stretch?
I mean, when you look at CJ Stroud prior to losing Tank Dell, and I think he's missing a couple of offensive linemen. I mean, he had the Texans looking like, one of the better teams in the NFL. And we saw what the Texans looked like without him. And then he comes back, he gets them back into the playoffs after I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 year hiatus. Of course, we know what happened with Deshaun Watson and everything, but I mean, I think they belong. I think CJ Stroud is that good. D'Amico Ryans is that good. Is that we're seeing a very special talent in CJ Stroud. I mean, I think he's looking like he's going to be in that tier 1 with a Patrick Mahomes, a Joe Burrow. He looks like he belongs in that tier. And DeMeco Ryans looks like he might be the next, really good young head coach in the league.
Yeah, I think I think with all due respect to Puka Nacua, I think CJ Stroud has had the best rookie season I've seen since like Randy Moss. Like, what he's doing, Moss had like 17 touchdowns as a rookie. And he didn't even start every game. But Stroud's just been unbelievable. Like, to do that in his first playoff game, after the regular season he had, it's just really impressive. And if you're the Panthers, I don't know how you can even watch this without just throwing up every time you see CJ Stroud drop back to pass. I know like things could change. Maybe Bryce Young gets better and, in a better situation, but man, that looks like one of the all-time, like when Michael Jordan went third in the draft, just one of the all-time whiffs.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's hard to compare those situations because you look at Carolina and their head coach and everything, that just wasn't a good fit. But where DeMeco Ryans and CJ Stroud and everything, it seems to be a perfect fit. Let's talk about another really good team, or a really good quarterback rather. That's Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes. Kansas City's offense, man, has been kind of inconsistent all season. Their defense has really been the strength of that team this season. Carrying them to the playoffs, but. You look at Mahomes and Pacheco and Rice, they played really well in that playoff game, leading them to victory. Is this offense starting to click, you think?
I'm going to say maybe. It was such a weird game because of the weather and because Miami's defense was so injured. They had two street free agents as their edge rushers, right? They had Melvin Ingram and Justin Houston, instead of Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips. And they were without Xavier Howard, and they were without Javon Holland, and they were without Jerome Baker. Like Fangio, they did a good job because they kept holding Kansas City to field goals.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'd be a little concerned about if I'm looking at the Chiefs. And, look, they can run the ball. And, that was like the perfect weather for Pacheco. Like that guy just runs so angry. And it was cold, no one likes the contact when it's like that. And he's a punishing runner. Rashee Rice is really coming along and looks like he could be a number one receiver. Kelsey had a good game too. I think Kelsey had like 7 for 7, and they didn't drop passes, which was weird because, no team has had more drops this year. And you would think in that weather, guys, Mahomes throwing hard, guys would be dropping passes. I don't think they dropped a pass. So that was surprising. But I'd be a little concerned about how many times they stalled in the red zone and settled for field goals. Because against a team like the Bills, who they've gone toe-to-toe with so many times in recent years. This is the game of the weekend, I think. And we'll get into that. But I'm not so sure their offense is fully back. They still didn't look like Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. That Dolphins team is a team they could have, with all those injuries, they should have scored in the 30s, and maybe if it was warmer, they would have. So I'm not fully convinced.
That's fair.
Yeah. So let me shift to the team that played against your Cowboys. Jordan Love, who had really been playing well coming into this game, like his numbers were pretty crazy over the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season. And then he had a perfect passer rating in this game. And look, some guys were like really open, like that touchdown to Kraft. I don't think there was a Cowboy within 25 yards of him. But, Love just played great. Aaron Jones had 3 rushing touchdowns. 7 different players had a reception. I think something like 5 different guys had at least 40 yards receiving for the Packers. They had all kinds of interesting stats like that. Was that a product of good coaching or a great game plan, or were they just playing against a defense that just didn't show up?
I think, I don't want to take anything away from Love and Jones and their receivers. Romeo Doubs had a good game. I think it really LaFleur just called a really good game against the defense that decided to have its worst day on a bad day, have have a bad day on the worst time, however the saying goes. I think it's definitely a little bit of both, but honestly, man, just the way that they executed that game plan. I mean, LaFleur is he's really earned my respect a lot with this season, because I don't think a lot of people expected the Packers to do much of anything with Jordan Love and that kind of mismatch of young receivers who all have really good skill sets, but are just inexperienced. And, I don't know what their defensive numbers are off the top of my head or anything, but a defense that doesn't probably middle of the pack or, and in the 20s at least. But for them to come out and do that says a lot about that team and LaFleur as a coach.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about how there were like 4 different times in that game where, coming out of a timeout, the Packers either scored a touchdown or had like a massive play. And so, you see that, and then you look at the coach and say, okay, he saw something, he called something in a timeout, and it worked every time. So yeah, I think LaFleur doesn't get enough credit. They had those. I mean, they were like the Cowboys for a couple of years there. They were, and it was worse because they were like the 1 seed and they were losing playoff games. Those 2 years that Rodgers was the MVP. I mean, that's the irony in all this, right? Is that Rodgers leaves, they missed the playoffs, Rodgers last year, he leaves, and once again, a guy who's been sitting for 3 years, like they did with Rodgers behind Brett Favre, comes in and not only gets them to the playoffs, but wins at least 1 playoff game. So, it was a win-win for the Packers and Jordan Love, and he looks like the real deal. Now, again, there's always a tendency, and I try to guard against this, and I'll talk about this more later when we start previewing next week, but there's a tendency to overreact to what you see in the first round of the playoffs. A lot of things reverse in the second round, and both Jordan Love and CJ Stroud have huge tests this week, right? They're going up against on the road at the Ravens, at the 49ers. So, if they can come close to duplicating what they each did this week, I'll be
praising.
Let's see it first, because sometimes you just catch a defense that's just not having its day. I mean, the Browns defense had a bad day, and so did the Cowboys defense. Now, you got to credit the offense for that, but also, that there's an element of that isn't repeatable, and we'll see.
Yeah. So, sticking with kind of good stories here, Dave, I don't know how much of a surprise this was. I actually did expect the Rams to beat Detroit, but, Detroit won a close game, an emotional game against the Rams. The main story kind of being discussed was the hit Kirby Joseph made on Tyler Higbee, and apparently that's his second hit of that kind this season, but, ended up causing a torn ACL. With the rumors of there being about banning the horse collar tackle, is this another problem that needs fixing, you think?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Just on that game, I thought the Rams kind of left that game on the table. They like the Chiefs, kept getting in the red zone and kept settling for field goals. And, credit the Detroit defense for kind of bending, not breaking. But, 3 different times the Rams got down inside the 10 and walked away with field goals in a game that they would go on to lose by 1 point. I'll tell you one thing. I was nervous. I was nervous that game was going to come down to Brett Maher's foot. And after what we saw in the playoffs last year, I was just envisioning, because they had the ball late, and then they got that holding penalty. It took them out of field goal range. But it would have been, the Rams special teams killed them all year. And I was just, the ending I was envisioning was, they get down to about the 30. It's, so it's a pretty long field goal, like 47, 48 yards. And Maher just, hooks it 40 yards left, but it didn't happen. So credit the Lions. They played well enough to win the game by a point against a good team. I mean, it's a bummer that those 2 teams, I think, played each other in round 1, because I think the Rams, probably a top 3 team in the NFC, 3 or 4 team, and be good if they were playing this weekend. And I think they deserved it. And that, Puka Nakua's performance, we shouldn't leave that game without discussing it. That was just amazing. And he was getting lit up And we'll talk about the hits from the Detroit secondary in a second, because that's the question you asked me. But he just kept getting lit up, going over the middle, and it didn't slow him down at all. Like, he's a big dude, and he can take punishment. That was really impressive. Maybe as he turns into a veteran, he'll realize he can't keep taking hits like that. But right now he's kind of young and dumb, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. Like, he's fearless. You don't see that many receivers these days that are fearless to go over the middle, but so far he is, and he really had an amazing game. The Kirby, you're right. He's also the one who ended TJ Hawkinson's season with a similar hit to the knees. And he also had a kind of a vicious high hit on Justin Jefferson in that same game. I don't think he's necessarily a dirty player. I mean, that hit to the legs is unfortunately legal. And I think, every time I hear receivers interviewed about this stuff, they're like, we would much rather it be legal that they could headhunt and go and hit us high, because NFL players, you hit them low, it can end their season. You hit them high, you can concuss them or whatever. And I'm not making light of that, but I think if it was up to the players, they would say, protect our legs, don't protect our heads. And I think the challenge for the league is, if you tell defenders they can't go for the legs and they can't go for the head, there's not much target area there. And, you make the game. Yeah. It's bad enough when, like, quarterbacks are running like Josh Allen was, and it looks like maybe he's going to slide and the defense stops. And, like, the defense, there's so much they're not allowed to do right now. I'm a little bit of a purist and an old schooler, I guess, but I don't want to see guys get hurt. But I think you just can't legislate like every tough hit out of the game, or defenders will have nowhere left to go. I mean, what do you think on this issue?
No, like you, I mean, it's already so geared toward offense, and there's so many benefits for offensive players, especially quarterbacks, that, at some point something's got to give. And, I don't necessarily, I think if it were me, I'd rather get hit below the waist. I don't want to get hit in the head. I mean, because I know it's been a long time, but you just think about guys being paralyzed or concussed, and then the damage that it does even after their career is over. The damage that it does after not playing. That permanent damage, if you will. Yeah. So I don't know what you can do. I mean, I think you touched on it perfectly. Like, you can't really make any more rules to help the offense, because the defense is already at a disadvantage so much.
Yeah, and they just won't know how to tackle. I mean, you can't eliminate the whole body. All right, so we've hit on all the games except for two, so we'll get to these last two fairly quickly. So the Steelers, snuck their way into the playoffs, another winning season for Tomlin. That's all he's had as their coach. 16 straight winning seasons on his resume, but they haven't had a deep playoff run in a long time. They kind of seem to be a little bit like stuck in the mud as a franchise, as like perennially like better than mediocre, but not even like very good. They're just kind of good. Like, is this holding them back in the long run? Where do you see this franchise headed?
It's interesting because they win so many games. Since Big Ben's retired, Pittsburgh has been looking for his replacement, but because of Tomlin, they either make it to the playoffs or win just enough games to put themselves out of reach to draft a quarterback of note. I mean, Kenny Pickett, they were able to draft him in the first round, but there's already questions about him. Of course, they're going to ride with him next season, in 2024, so they say. But it's a weird situation because you don't want to ever encourage your team to lose, but at the same time, we've seen when a team does kind of decide to tank a season to give themselves a chance to draft what could be a franchise quarterback. I mean, you look at what the Texans were able to do. You look at what the Bengals were able to do. Of course, I think those franchises had a couple of bad seasons, but I think that's what Pittsburgh needs to do. I'm not, they don't need to part ways with Tomlin, but I think I don't know how they can go about being bad while also letting Tomlin be the coach that he is.
Yeah. And you look at the division they're in, and it's not, it's probably top to bottom the strongest division in the NFL, and certainly going into next season. If the Browns can stay healthier than they did this year, the Bengals get Joe Burrow back, the Ravens are who they are, and now they've got Lamar locked up long term, and he's the MVP this year, and playing his best football, or maybe 2019 was better, but it's not an easy division to like win 10 games in, if you've got to play those other teams 6 times. So yeah, I think the Steelers are in kind of a bit of a tough spot, and they don't have a quarterback, so they're kind of, I think, sort of stuck in the mud a little bit. But most fan bases would take it, because they're in the playoffs and most years, and they are competitive. But like you said, it makes it hard for them to ever like really reset. And TJ Watt's 29. I think Minka Fitzpatrick's got to be around that age, or maybe even 30. Like, the stars on their defense are getting older. Like, I'm not really sure what that team's window is to stay like this, but they draft so well and they have such a good system that, it's like just perpetual goodness. And you can't really say that about other teams in the NFL. They're kind of unique in that regard.
Yeah, I do kind of wonder, just sticking with the Steelers here. We've seen so many what we thought were franchise quarterbacks either, not get re-signed and signed with other teams, or even get traded away. I wonder if they could be players in maybe like the Russell Wilson sweepstakes. I don't know how good he is these days, but I'd imagine he gives them a little bit more than a Kenny Pickett would. But I wonder what their move would be. They could always try to spend money in free agency as opposed to trying to be bad enough to draft a good one.
Yeah, it's so not the Steelers' way, though. Like, I can't think of any time they've like brought in a free agent quarterback. I mean, they had been there for so long.
Yeah, they did go after the franchise QB, Mr. Trubisky.
Oh, that's true. top 2 pick.
Yes, sticking with quarterbacks who have kind of, I don't know, one style were maybe franchise quarterbacks, but have kind of moved around. It's Tampa Bay and Baker Mayfield. And a year after losing Tom Brady and being counted out by everyone in the football world, Tampa Bay won the NFC South and beat a former Super Bowl team in the Eagles. Is Baker Mayfield resurrecting his career, or is he benefiting from having to play bad competition?
It's a good question, and I'll answer it in a second. I want to make sure we don't leave this game without talking about what a complete debacle the last 8 weeks have been for the Eagles. That they were 10-1. But a lot of their metrics weren't that great when they were 10-1. They were maybe a little bit of an illusory 10-1. And then, they lost 5 of their last 6 and against some bad teams. They lost. They got killed by the Giants the last game of the season, which mattered, a week after losing to the Cardinals. And those were both home games. Oh no, the Giant game was in New York, but the Cardinal game was at home. And they just didn't look like they wanted to be there the other night. Like, they couldn't tackle. They were in the game for a little bit, and then I think once that safety happened, it was kind of over. And the tush push didn't even work. Like, when that happened, I was like, okay, Tampa Bay is winning this game, because that play had not failed. I think it had failed once all year. So just, I don't know how much we need to talk about the Eagles, but that's another question. Like, is Sirianni coming back? I assume he is, but there's a lot of stories came out after that game about a lot of internal strife there and how maybe he lost the locker room. So that's another coaching situation to maybe keep an eye on, despite the success he's had the last 2 seasons. But getting to your question on Baker, I mean, I think, they put up a graphic during the game on Monday that he's had 8 head coaches in 6 seasons. And, he was drafted into a terrible situation in Cleveland with, awful coaching and a bad roster and a team that had, would get like the first pick every year or a top 3 pick every year, because they were always like, this is back when there were 16 games. They were like 3-13 every year. So he was drafted into a bad situation, and, he had all those like commercial opportunities and, probably was made a star before he was one.
Right.
Heisman Trophy winner, first pick, all of that. And then another bad situation for him in Carolina. He had that like cup of coffee with the Rams. Now he's in a stable environment and getting a chance to, play in a place with good weapons, great receivers, good coaching, a good offensive line. And I think he's showing that he can be a starting quarterback in the NFL. Maybe not an upper echelon one necessarily, but maybe in that kind of middle range of QBs, like a Jared Goff, who's played great the last 2 years. So maybe not quite in that range, but he's proving himself and he's going to get paid, I think.
Yeah, it looks like that. What's funny, you mentioned the cup of coffee in Los Angeles. What really kind of turned this thing around for him is apparently while he was there, Sean McVay was like, "Hey man, we're not really going anywhere. Just be yourself. Just kind of have fun and be yourself, and don't worry about anything else. Just be yourself and just play ball." And I guess he took that mentality with him to Tampa. He's on a 1-year deal and everything, that with really nothing to lose. And that's kind of, been what's been the difference maker for him.
Yeah.
Of course, other than being in the stable situation.
Yeah. But, they brought him in to compete with Kyle Trask, right? It wasn't like they were bringing him in and saying, it's your job. Like, cause he's failed in a couple other spots. They were like, and he obviously, outplayed Trask in the preseason, and, it's a bad division. And so maybe he didn't play the toughest schedule, but they won their division and they won a playoff game and they're still alive. So credit to Baker Mayfield. Before we leave the wild card discussion and preview the four remaining 4 games for this week, let's each just give a quick takeaway from wild card round. I guess my biggest one is, if you had told me maybe 7 or 8 weeks ago that after the wild card round there would be no NFC East teams still playing and 2 teams from the NFC North, I might have asked you what you were smoking, but that's where we are. In the AFC, my other takeaway would be, like, in the AFC, all the home teams won, all the wild cards got eliminated. The 3 division winners won, and now they get added to the Ravens. So you've got the 4 division winners, kind of what appears to be the 4 best teams clearly in the AFC are still playing. The NFC, that the Packers kind of crashed the party. And, I guess my biggest takeaway, though, is just how Stroud and Love played. And we've hit on that already. And just how crazy that is to see that in each of their first years as a starter. What are your biggest takeaways from wild card weekend?
What stood out to me, more so reminded me of, even if you want to call it a refresher, it's just, once the playoffs start, man, every team is 0-0, and the NFL is truly just a 1-week season, and anything can happen, man. I mean, we saw with the Cowboys. It's just, I hate to be reminded in the way that I was reminded of that, but it really is. The playoffs are such a different animal that you kind of see who's for real and who's not.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy when you're watching your team and you're just watching the clock and you're like, this is it. The season's ticking down. If they can't do something on this possession, it's probably over. And then they don't do anything and they punt, and you're like, okay, well, if they can get a stop real quick, and then you just see the sand slipping through the hourglass and you realize it's not going to happen. It's tough, because these guys show up for work in July or whatever it is, and it's a long slog of a season, 18 weeks with the bye, and, they only play once a week. So it's like a weekly drama of ups and downs, and then it all comes down to 60 minutes, like you said, and anything can happen.
Absolutely.
Which is why I was thinking, like, if the whole Rams season came down to a Brett Maher field goal, that was just going to be maybe too much for Ram fans to watch.
Hey, he can kick field goals. He just can't kick those extra points.
Yeah, maybe that's the secret.
So, moving on here, we're going to do our a divisional round preview here, Dave, and we'll start off with Baltimore. Baltimore has been off for a week, and their starters have been off even longer. After seeing how Love and Stroud performed in their first playoff starts, could Baltimore be the next team to be on the wrong side of an upset?
Well, as we discussed, anything can happen in a playoff game, and the Texans and Packers are dangerous because they're like both teams that no one thought would be where they are right now. So they're kind of playing with, to use a cliche, kind of playing with house money and, trying to get their young team more meaningful reps that'll matter in future years when these teams might be more serious contenders, but they're here. So, why not keep trying to win, which is what they're obviously going to do. I don't see this one. I don't see this upset happening. I think the Ravens have just been so good all year. The 3 games they did lose could have easily been wins. They've played a few close games, but at home they've really kind of demolished some good teams. I mean, they killed Detroit, Seattle, Miami in their building. These teams did meet in week 1, which you can probably throw out. I mean, that was CJ Stroud's first game in the NFL. And Lamar didn't have a good game. And Lamar has not always been good in the playoffs. He mostly hasn't been the same player that he's been in the regular season. So I'd maybe be a tiny bit worried about that. But I just think the Ravens on both sides of the ball have just been clicking in a way that, you saw it in that San Francisco game, in that Miami game, and the Detroit game, like what they can do against good teams. And I don't see it. But you never know. What do you think?
Man, CJ Stroud is so special that I think it's going to be closer than people might think that it's going to be. But Baltimore really is good. They're experienced, man. Lamar's been there. Harbaugh's been there. That defense is even probably better than the Browns. Maybe not by maybe the numbers say otherwise, but I just the way that offense is clicking, it's going to be a tough test for Houston for sure. But CJ Stroud is that special that I would not be surprised if they did win that game.
Yeah, I mean, the Browns defense has been a little bit home road all year. Really tough at home and not as good on the road. And I think you saw that in the wild card round. The Ravens defense has been pretty good wherever they've been. And that week of rest matters. So there were some hard hitting games this past weekend, and you saw that. Like that Lions-Rams game was a really hard hitting game.
Yeah.
And so we'll see if that, if it matters for the teams that didn't play last week, and had a week to rest up, and everyone's injured this time of year, right? So getting that bye week has proven to be pretty huge historically. And like I said earlier, I really try not to overreact too much to what you see in the wild card round, and especially because there's 2 teams we didn't see at all, right? So there's no reason to discount the Ravens because they didn't play last week,
right?
Or the 49ers. So speaking of the 49ers, Matt LaFleur and Kyle Shanahan are going to be meeting in the playoffs for the 3rd time in 5 years.
Man.
So do we have like a rivalry brewing here?
It looks like it. I know 2 of those times, of course, were Aaron Rodgers and the Niners got the best of him both times, if I recall correctly. Pretty good games too.
Yeah.
I remember the Blizzard game where it was really low scoring and it ended up being a turnover, like a blocked field goal or something.
Yep.
That ended up being the difference maker. But I think so, just because really you think about the LaFleur connection with Shanahan, being part of that coaching tree, and both of those teams being with the history of the teams, and the Niners being the juggernaut here lately, and even the 49ers, not the 49ers, but the Packers even kind of being considered juggernauts too, and LaFleur's time. I do think this is a bit of a rivalry that's starting to brew. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I think so. It's funny because you think of the Packers without Rodgers as a different team.
Exactly.
Those other years, Rodgers was there, and he was the story of that team. And it was almost like you didn't even think about the coach because they had a coach on the field. But very impressive that LaFleur with a new quarterback has gotten where he is. These teams obviously know each other well. And, the Packers are the youngest team in the NFL. So they are, like I said, I mean, I used the cliche before, they're playing with house money. That makes them dangerous. But like, I think with both this game and the Ravens game, if they're not in it early, if the Packers and the Texans are not in those games early, I don't think they'll be in those games. So I think the first quarters of both games are going to be really important. Like if the Packers get the ball first and, that Niners defense is fired up and they go 3 and out, and then the Niners just march right down the field and get a quick 7-0 lead like they've done so many times to so many teams this season. The Packers could easily, you could see a lopsided game here. I mean, remember, 2 weeks ago, the Packers should have lost to the Panthers, right? Or 3 weeks ago in week 17. And that was 2 weeks after they lost to Tommy DeVito and the Giants. So let's not put the Packers on this pedestal like they're been this great team all year. Love is playing great now, and they have four receivers who are either rookies or second-year players who all look really good and are kind of interchangeable and create a lot of matchup problems. But their defense has not been good most of the season. And has been pretty victimized through the air. And I could just see the 49ers, dissecting them with the weapons they have. But you never know. I mean, that's why they play the games. And, it's right now it's 0-0, right?
Right.
So anything can happen. But we'll get into our game predictions in a minute. But, it is good to see these two coaches, going at each other, just like it was good to see Sean McVay and Dan Campbell. These are like the top coaches in the NFC, I would say. Those four probably. So
I would agree.
I agree with that. It's good to see the chess match.
For sure. So, another chess match. I don't know what your thoughts are on Tampa Bay's head coach, but the Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield both being number 1 picks and have since then moved on from the team that drafted them and have had success in today's NFL. Is team situation more important than ever for quarterbacks, Dave?
Yeah, I think so, and it gets back to comments I made earlier about Baker and the situation he was drafted into, which was way less than ideal with a dysfunctional and talent barren Browns team. And then, you look at Bryce Young this year, which I mentioned earlier, like he had no chance to succeed. For all we know, he is an NFL quarterback. But, there was bad coaching and they made a coaching change in the middle of the season. His best receiver was Adam Thielen, who's, like a 33-year-old cast off from the Vikings. And then some rookie and second-year receivers who kind of weren't really ready. Okay running backs, nothing special, not a great offensive line. So, landing spot matters a lot. And in today's NFL, these quarterbacks who get taken in the top 5, barring a trade up by a really good team, are usually going to a team that just won like 2, 3, or 4 games. So what happened with CJ Stroud this year is the outlier. More often than not, it's, the Zach Wilson first year, or the Bryce Young first year, or, the Trevor Lawrence first year, the Peyton Manning first year, the Troy Aikman first year. These even great quarterbacks. Now the difference there is those guys were more talented and they proved it. But those were teams that were building the right way and had that like one reset year. And then, were able to build around that quarterback, that franchise guy. I think landing spot matters a lot. I think we judge quarterbacks sometimes a little too harshly or a little too favorably without thinking enough about how much of a chance did they really have? Or was it, like Brock Purdy's in the perfect landing spot. If you put him on the Panthers this year, would he be a good player? If you put Bryce Young drafted him into that 49ers system, would he be a good player?
Oh
So,
my God, yeah.
I think it matters a lot. That's my short answer. As for this game, I feel good for both of these quarterbacks because
Mhm.
they were both much maligned after their rookie seasons, and in both cases it was like there were guys taken after them, where people pointed at it and said, I mean, Carson Wentz went right after Jared Goff, and he had an MVP, or what would have been an MVP season, where his team won the Super Bowl. So people were like, why did you take Goff over Wentz? And then in the case of Mayfield, you had Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson later in that first round. And so, you could look at it and say, well, why did you take? And those guys went to much better landing spots than Mayfield did. So yeah, I think it matters a lot.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So speaking of Josh Allen, and I alluded to this earlier, I mean, I think this is the game of the week, given the history between the Bills and the Chiefs, both regular season where they've played some great games and playoffs where they played, maybe the best playoff game any of us have ever seen, a couple years ago in the divisional round. So they meet again in the playoffs. Allen has yet to beat Mahomes in the playoffs, but interestingly enough, this is Patrick Mahomes' first road playoff game, not counting Super Bowls. Every year the Chiefs have had, the road has gone through them, and all his playoff games have been at home. So the Bills are kind of banged up right now. The Chiefs have, not been the Chiefs that we expected. Do the Bills have enough to beat them?
And the Bills have been so inconsistent. So have the Chiefs as well. But I feel like the Bills more so have been so inconsistent. You look at their defense; it's not very strong. They've had some injuries there as well. I don't know. I just don't know if this is their year. I mean, I like what their offense has become. I feel like they kind of limped into the playoffs a little bit, and Mahomes, they like I said, they've been inconsistent as well, but their defense has been strong all year. And I had a feeling, I talked about it on the Cowboys pod, that Andy Reid and the Chiefs, I felt like this offense would figure things out at the right time being at the playoffs. And I think we saw a glimpse of that. Of course, we saw them do that against the banged up Dolphins defense, but I don't trust the Bills. I don't. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, we'll get to this when we get to our picks. So maybe I'll reserve my comments. But yeah, I mean, like going into the season, I think most people would have said, and if you looked at the Super Bowl odds, it was like the Chiefs, the Bills, and the Bengals. They were the three teams, and if you look at the last couple seasons, that makes sense. Those were the teams that have had the most success in the AFC the last 2 years at least. And the Bills and the Chiefs have both been much more flawed teams this year than I think people expected. Whereas the Ravens have been the least flawed AFC team. And if the Ravens can beat the Texans, the winner of this game that will have to go to Baltimore, which I think is going to be a tall order for either of these teams, just given some of the problems they've each had this year. So this is the game I'm most looking forward to watching, and I think it's the last game of the weekend. I'm just hoping we get better games this weekend. If you look at this wild card round, and we talked about it a lot, and there was a lot of interesting stuff that went on. And again, it was made even more interesting by all the big coaching news that was kind of happening around the weekend. Sort of like the end of an era with guys like Belichick and Pete Carroll, and then Nick Saban at Alabama. Like, these have been like pillars of football coaching for the last 2 decades. But then the games were disappointing. I mean, the only good game from a viewing standpoint, and the only close game was that Rams-Lions game, which was a great game. All the other games were, at least one team kind of not in it or playing very sloppy, or both. And another team dominating, and very little drama, So I'm just hoping. I hope the games this weekend are more compelling, and that when we get on the air, hopefully next week again, we have better games to talk about.
Yeah, this game, of course, is probably going to be the game of the week, but I'm really interested to see Baker and Goff go head to head, only because I know both of them have been there at different times, but I don't know how much people really believed in the Lions this year. I mean, they were a feel good story, but I don't know how good people really thought that they were. I don't think anybody thought they were going to be this good, and then nobody thought Tampa Bay was going to do anything. That game is intriguing just because it could either be a high scoring affair, or it could be a blowout. One team just really kind of dismantling the other.
Yeah, and one of those teams is going to the NFC Championship. So,
Look,
there were a lot of people like Detroit when they won that last game last season against the Packers, and it kind of ended like, I think they won like 6 of their last 7 last year, and they were clearly a team on the rise. And a lot of people, they were kind of a sexy preseason pick to win the NFC North, which they did. But I don't think people saw them making the leap all the way to like going to the Super Bowl this year. And they're one home game away from playing to go to the Super Bowl. So it is surprising to me that one of these two teams will be in the NFC Conference Championship. But again, I would have expected the NFC Conference Championship, like midway through the season, it really looked like it was San Francisco, Dallas, and Philly on one level, and then the rest, the other NFC teams, with Detroit being the next best. Being a clear tier below. And so I would have thought the NFC Conference Championship was going to be, some matchup of Dallas, Philly, San Francisco. And obviously that's not going to happen. So yeah, I'm very interested to watch that Tampa. And it's also a good clash of, like, both of those teams are hard to run on, but not that hard to throw on.
Right.
And so, and both teams have good receiving weapons. So I think that game could be a little more like shootouty than maybe people are thinking. I mean, it was, that Rams Lions game. If you bet the over in that game, you were feeling great at halftime. I think there were 38 points in the first half, and the over under, maybe there were 31 points or something like that. It was a fairly high scoring first half. And then all that happened in the second half was, that's what it was. There were 38 in the first half. The over under was around 50. And then there were only 3 field goals in the second half. The defenses started playing better and tightened up. But I could see, I could see this being a little bit of a sneaky shootout. And with both quarterbacks kind of slinging it, which would be fun to see.
How crazy would a Green Bay Detroit Lions NFC Championship game be?
Yeah, and that's the only chance we've got for 2 teams from the same division, right? Because the AFC, you've got the 4 division winners, and the NFC, you've just got 2 teams from one division. So yeah, that would be crazy. We'll see if it happens.
All right, Dave. Let's pick our winners and losers here in these games. Baltimore versus Houston. Who wins this one?
I think Baltimore wins this by at least a touchdown. Again, I think if it's not close early, it'll get less and less close. Baltimore's had a lot of games this year where they just, they get a lead and then the other team starts turning the ball over and it gets ugly. Yeah. I don't know that that'll happen, but I think Baltimore wins this one without breaking too much of a sweat. What do you think?
CJ Stroud is so good. I hate to vote against him, but as much as I like him and I like what Houston's doing, I like the story. This is probably going to be Baltimore, by a touchdown, like you said. I think Baltimore's too experienced, too good.
All right, San Francisco versus Green Bay. Who wins?
I don't know. There's no rhyme or reason for this pick, but I can see San Francisco being upset only because that's just, kind of how these rivalries go, where one team is a juggernaut, one team sneaks in. It's like we've seen the Giants do it. I like LaFleur and I like that offense, and I don't know why. I think San Francisco being off might they might be rusty and they might do more harm than good. What about you, Dave?
As good as the Packers looked last week, they're the youngest team in the NFL, and I think that's going to show this week. And I think, Jordan Love has been playing great lately. He had a rough stretch earlier in the season. He does have a lot of weapons, and everyone's kind of healthy now, finally. And Aaron Jones, like 3 straight 100-yard games. I mean, I could see the case for them, kind of going back and forth with the Niners. But that Niners defense, I think is going to show up. And I think this one gets away from the Packers, and the Niners win by at least 2 scores. So I'll take them to win pretty comfortably.
All right. Probably the right choice there.
Well, that's why they play the games.
Exactly. Detroit versus Tampa Bay, who you got?
So I'm having trouble picking the next 2. This one I'll stick with the Lions, but I think this is going to be a close game. As much as the Bucks, kind of, they don't have a lot of great wins this year, but they have some good ones. And, I know the Eagles were not the Eagles, but they really put it on them last week, and their defense played especially well. Like, Philly's defense is terrible. I'm not surprised that Tampa was able to score. I do think they'll struggle to run the ball against the Lions, but I think they'll have success throwing on them. And I think this is going to be a very close game, maybe come down to the last possession. But I think the home field, I think it's going to be noisy as hell in that dome. These are fans that have waited like 3 decades for home playoff games. And I think that'll be the difference. I just think Detroit playing at home, having the crowd behind them, puts them over the top in a close game. What do you think?
Yeah, this is an interesting one too, but I just, I try not to think about the NFL being scripted and whatnot, but I just have a feeling that the NFL wants Detroit to win this game. So I'm going with Detroit.
Okay, let's hope there's no shenanigans or fix in. And so the last game of the weekend, Buffalo versus Kansas City. Who wins?
I'm not going to go against Patrick Mahomes in this one. Man, he's got too much experience, too many big wins, even in his first road playoff game, which is insane. I've still got to go with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. Yeah,
I want to take the Bills in this game, but I've just seen too many sloppy games from them this season. Too many turnovers. Beating the Steelers last week, that's not that impressive to me. And they didn't really, they beat them fairly handily, but I don't know. They're not getting the ball to Stephon Diggs. And the Chiefs have a good defense. So, the first time they played this year, if Kadarius Toney hadn't lined up offsides, they probably end up winning that game. These are very evenly matched teams. And like you, I'll go with the Mahomes-Reed combo. But this game could obviously go either way. And, if you're the Bills, it's kind of now or never in some ways. I know Josh Allen's a young player, but, I feel like they've had a window the last couple years and they haven't been able to get over the hump. They haven't even gotten to an AFC title game. And so I think this is a really important game for that franchise, but I don't think the Chiefs are going down that easy. So I'll stick with the Chiefs.
All right, Dave, give us your bold call playoff edition, sir.
Well, I forgot to prepare one. So my bold call is going to be that Josh Allen's going to turn over the ball at least 3 times, and that's going to be the difference in that game. What is your bold call? I don't know how bold that is either, because he turns the ball over a lot, but I think that's going to be the difference in the game.
I think he's had 15 interceptions this year, I believe. Dave, my bold call, Matt LaFleur and the Green Bay Packers will be the first 7th seed to go to a conference title game.
I like it. We'll see if it happens, but
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But I do like
All right, Dave, man, I enjoyed the discussion. It's been a couple of weeks. It was nice to get back to it.
100%. Thanks for the great discussion, and I hope folks listening enjoyed the show tonight. Paul, remind everyone where they can find you on X and your content too.
Yes, you can find me on not Twitter at Paul_Ryan15, and my content will be streaming every Monday on YouTube and on Twitter. It's going to be Cowboys focused. Of course, the Cowboy season being over, so we'll be talking about the playoffs and any and all relevant Cowboys news. But we will be keeping up to date what's going on in the NFL and, of course, anything Cowboys related. Dave, what about you? Where can we find you on not Twitter, and what content can we expect from you?
Yep, you can find me on not Twitter at PigskinPapers. I've taken a little writing hiatus since the end of the regular season because 2 fantasy columns per week was kind of burning me out. Not entirely sure how much off-season content I'll have. I usually do playoff previews. I haven't done them for the first 2 weeks, but I'll probably do them for the conference championships and the Super Bowl, and then I'll have some content around the NFL draft as well. So keep an eye out for posts from me that have my content in them.
Yes, sir. As always, man. I love your articles. They're always great. So be sure to
Thank you. I
look out
appreciate
for those
that.
guys. Guys, we appreciate you joining us, and we will see y'all next week.